Okay, I'm going to pick up in about the middle of the chapter with where the textbook picks up with the Federalist era, and this is really this period of time after the completion of the Constitution, the ratification, the push for ratification by the Federalists, and of course the opposition to ratification by the Anti-Federalists. The But the Constitution is going. The Constitution is in place. The Bill of Rights are being worked on or will be worked on during Washington's first administration. And even Franklin remarked, as your book points out, that everything seems to be working. Okay. So we kind of get into the beginnings of our first president. All right. The Federalist term of George Washington. Washington was a leader, and Washington is, he may not be the smartest guy in the room, but he is certainly probably the toughest. And Washington is a great choice for leader. After being elected in March of 1789, the Congress convenes its first meeting in New York City. New York City will serve as our first capital. The Washington is responsible for several things. One of the most important things he does is during his first administration, you have to understand that most of the bureaucracy, most of the underpinnings of the government have to be established because they're not there. This is a totally new government. So Washington has to put a lot of this into place and start to shape the new nation. One of the most important things that happens early on, though, and this is really in some ways outside of really what we kind of call the official Washington administration, is that you're beginning to see in American history the development of political parties, what we will refer to as political parties. You already know what they are. The Federalists, who supported the Constitution, and the Anti-Federalists, who did not. Those are going to eventually morph into the nation's two major political parties in the beginning. Okay, Washington is not a big fan of political parties, but they are happening, and they're happening really behind the scenes. You can see them every day, and we're going to talk about them as they continue to develop. So the Federalists are controlled by and will follow the lead of Alexander Hamilton. They favored the Constitution and favored a strong central government. They would be pro-British in their outlook and foreign policy. The Anti-Federalists, who are going to morph into and become eventually we'll actually call them several names: the Democratic Republicans, the Republicans, the Jeffersonians, the Jeffersonian Republicans. Okay, they originally opposed the Constitution until it was ratified, but they still favored strong state government, most of the powers remaining with the state, which means they are not a big fan of strong central government. They prefer a weak central government, much like what we had during the Articles. They're going to take their lead from Thomas Jefferson, and they will be pro-French in their foreign policy. They haven't coalesced yet. Okay, they're getting there, but you're starting to see the underpinnings really of the political parties and the development of the political parties here in America. So keep that in mind and watch for these differences, especially between Hamilton and Jefferson. Washington, of course, is our first president, elected in 1789, elected unanimously by the Electoral College. The runner-up in the election was John Adams, who becomes vice president. So your first president and vice president, Washington and Adams. Washington, the Constitution says, has the right to request written opinions from the heads of the executive departments. And so Congress in Washington will actually build on ones that already technically sort of existed under the Articles, and will choose the heads of those departments and begin to meet with the heads of those departments for advice and assistance as talked about in the Constitution. This is the first cabinet. Cabinet is a series of advisors to the executive. these executive heads, they oversee their departments, and they one of their jobs is to offer advice and assistance to the chief executive, the president. The first cabinet is made up of Secretary of State, who is Thomas Jefferson, fresh back from his stint representing America in France. So Jefferson is back and will become the nation's Secretary of State. Now, remember that Jefferson is not a big fan of this new government, but Washington co-opts him, which is a sign of a good leader, into the government to make him a part of the government. So Jefferson has a tremendous pedigree, and there's no better probably representative of the state and more knowledgeable about foreign affairs at this time than Jefferson. He's a great pick, but it doesn't mean that he is going to get along with everyone else, and especially not with Hamilton, who becomes our Secretary of the Treasury. So Alexander Hamilton will become the first Secretary of the Treasury, and Secretary of War is Henry Knox, an old Army pal of Washington, as is Hamilton, who Knox is probably most famous for taking the guns out of Fort Ticonderoga and getting them to Boston during the Revolutionary War. So Knox and Hamilton are really old Revolutionary War buddies of the president. So the first cabinet, Secretary of State, Secretary of War, Secretary of Treasury, and then when Congress passes the Judiciary Act of 1789, you have your fourth, okay, the Edmund Randolph, who will become the first of our attorney generals, who is the head of the Justice Department. Also, the Judiciary Act of 1789 clears up the very vague Article 3 of the Constitution, which deals with the judicial branch. So district courts, appellate courts, federal courts, and the Supreme Court is the number of Supreme Court justices is set at 6. Okay, and this is the department that Randolph will take over. So there's Washington and his cabinet: the president, okay, Knox, Hamilton, Jefferson, and Randolph, and they are your first cabinet. So these four are responsible for advising the president about their departments. Washington puts Hamilton on the spot almost from the get-go. And Hamilton is going to be responsible, and Washington is going to put him in charge, really, of developing the first economic plan for the nation. Hamilton and Hamilton, of course, just recently has gotten tons of new information out about Hamilton because of the success of the musical. And which, by the way, if you've never seen, you really ought to go to Disney Plus and go and watch it. It's a wonderful story. All right, but Hamilton is really one of the really historical parts of Hamilton is that Hamilton was an amazing and bright individual. Okay, he grows up in the British West Indies, so he's really our only immigrant founding father. His father left him when he was young. His mother eventually dies. He works in a shipping business and operates the business really on his own. People around him realize what a gift he has, and so they essentially take up a collection to get Hamilton sent to New York to become educated. There, of course, when the Revolution breaks out, he joins the Continental Army. After the war, he becomes a lawyer and one of the most influential lawyers in New York, and he's a financial genius. And Hamilton, more than any person, is responsible for shaping the early American financial system. Hamilton is responsible for developing a plan for the nation, and he does, and he will report that back to Washington and to the cabinet. Hamilton's fiscal plan, as it is known, Alexander Hamilton's economic reforms, Alexander Hamilton's fiscal plan, whichever one you want to call it, is presented to the cabinet, and it is going to cause a real stir. Okay, it's not going to be one of the most popular things in the world, and it is certainly not going to be easy. But Hamilton essentially comes up with four major things. Okay, number one, we owe foreign nations money, and we should pay off that debt immediately. Okay, we owe at that time almost $12 million to places like France, whose most of it's owned to France. Okay, and we have to pay that off, and we have to pay it off in full. It's the only way that we can create confidence in the new nation and prove to everyone around us that we're not that we're willing to pay back our debts. Okay, we're building up credit and we're building up our reputation. So one, pay off the foreign war debt immediately. Okay, now others argue that this shouldn't be done. Okay, especially when Hamilton proposes number two. Okay, paying back the American people who bought Revolutionary War bonds. The United States owes $40 million to its own citizens who had purchased war bonds to help finance the war effort. And again, Hamilton argues that we have to pay this back. That's the only way to establish trust in a new nation. The government has to do what it said it would do. Okay, when the government sold these bonds to those citizens, they promised that if they held those bonds for a certain amount of time, the government would pay them back with interest. Okay. Now, there's some opposition to this. Jefferson, even James Madison, are not a big fan of this policy because they were worried that most of this money, especially the bond money, was going to go to Northerners rather than Southerners. A lot of Southerners who had bought bonds could not wait the necessary amount of time, and they needed money now. And so sometimes they sold off those bonds to speculators, people who would say, all right, you have you have this much. Let's say you have $500 worth of war bonds. Okay, you need money now, so I will give you, $100 for your $500 worth of bonds. Okay, so I come away with the bonds, you get $100 immediately. Well, when those bonds mature, because I'm wealthy enough to buy those bonds, when those bonds mature, I'm going to get paid back at $500. Okay, so I'm going to make money. Okay, when I get the interest and the face value of the bonds. Okay, you only walked away with just a small amount of what the bonds were actually worth. But many Southerners needed that money immediately after the war. And so a lot of this money is going to go to the North or go to other Northerners or go to people who are wealthy. And Jefferson is not a big fan of that. Okay, Jefferson is much more interested in the common man. Jefferson's a farmer at heart. Jefferson is a kind of a champion of the common guy to some extent. Okay, and so he sees this as problematic. Madison also saw it as problematic. Okay, so the debt issue doesn't get a whole lot of traction until Madison and Hamilton end up making a deal with one another in really the summer of 1790. So almost a year after taking office, okay, as Hamilton's fiscal plan is really struggling, Madison and Hamilton kind of reached this very secret deal. Madison promised that he would get the votes to get Hamilton's debt financing plan through the Congress if Hamilton agreed to push for the nation's capital to be moved to the border between Virginia and Maryland along the Potomac River. So this so-called Potomac bargain, the Compromise of 1790, whichever one you want to call it, ends up putting the nation's capital in the South and getting Hamilton's debt buyback plan through the Congress. So Hamilton, remember, argues that we have to pay off these debts, and so they have to be a part of it. Another big part of Hamilton's plan was not only paying back people and nations, but to take away the states' war debts. Some of the states still owed as much, if you total it all together, $25 million in debt. And so what Hamilton proposed is that the national government assume that debt, take it all over. That would tie the states to the federal government and free up the states to help with their own economy. Okay. That was not very popular among the states that had worked really hard, like Massachusetts, to pay back their debt already. Think about it. If they've already paid off their debt, now they have to turn around and start paying taxes to help other states who were just lazy to not pay off their debts. But it's a way to tie the nation together. Hamilton and Jefferson will really fight the most over the next one. To help administer all of this, Hamilton proposed the creation of a Bank of the United States, a national bank. Okay, the Bank of the United States, or the BUS as it'll be called, would hold all of the government's money. Okay, would have the power to transfer money, to make loans, whatever. Okay, to provide loans to the federal government, to other banks. Okay, and to manage the nation's monetary supply. So basically by regulating banknotes. So this would help unify the nation's currency, would help administer all of these plans to pay back the debt. And the creation of the bank, okay, would help the U.S. stabilize its economy. Okay, this is where we get one of the most important battles between Hamilton and Jefferson. Hamilton argues that the Constitution gives Congress the power to do this already. Inside of the Congress, there's an article that we sometimes call the Elastic Clause. Essentially, what it says is that Congress has the right to make any law necessary and proper to carrying out its duties. Okay? It's elasticity. It gives the Congress the ability to make law rather than to have to draft amendments and changes to the Constitution, which of course was something that the Articles didn't have. The Articles had no elasticity. Jefferson disagrees. Jefferson is a strict constructionist. In other words, Jefferson takes the document and looks at it, and if it's not there, he doesn't believe that power exists. Nowhere in the Constitution does it say that Congress has the right to create a bank. And so Jefferson feels like that this is not legal, that there's no constitutional power granted to Congress to allow them to create a Bank of the United States. If they want to give that power, then they have to make an amendment. Okay. Of course, Hamilton interprets the Constitution loosely and argues that, look, the power's already there, okay, through the necessary and proper clause. The two fall out over this. Hamilton and Jefferson become bitter enemies, and will continue to be bitter enemies, all right, through the rest of this period. All right, Washington has to make a decision, and Washington will end up siding with Hamilton, which sort of puts Jefferson on the outs. And the plan, Hamilton's fiscal plan, goes into effect. The Bank of the United States is created. The debt assumption takes place. Okay. Now, here's the deal. Hamilton is right. Hamilton's plan and the bank is right. And Hamilton's plan will help the United States start to begin to manufacture, to industrialize. Okay, the Treasury Department will begin to operate on a surplus because they begin to take in money, and they start paying off the Revolutionary War debts just as Hamilton had promised. Okay, so by the end, really, of almost the end of Washington's first term, the animosity between Hamilton and Jefferson is palpable. They do not like each other. They really just do not like each other. Hatred is probably a good word. The Washington begs both of them to try to bury their differences, and they don't. Okay. Okay. Let's talk about a couple of things that kind of finish off the Washington's first term. The fiscal plan, the building of a nation's government is one thing. Okay. But we also have some major foreign policy issues that Washington is going to have to deal with. Okay. One, the French Revolution breaks out in 1789. There is no doubt that this is a revolution. The French Revolution is one of the most studied events in world history. It is a true revolution. It is a social revolution. It is a political revolution. It is an economic revolution. In some cases, it is a spiritual revolution. It is as revolutionary as it gets. Okay, so the French Revolution breaks out in 1789, and that's going to affect us. Great Britain, because of the revolution, is going to end up going to war with France. And we are having problems with Spain because of its control over New Orleans. Okay, so let's take a look at some of Washington's foreign policy headaches. The biggest thing you have to understand about Washington is that Washington has to be cautious in foreign policy. The United States has no money to build up an army, to build up a navy. It has no ability to fight a foreign war. So Washington is going to take a very cautious approach, as he should. Washington's foreign policy dealing with France is pretty simple. The French Revolution starts in 1789 when the French rise up against the monarchy of Louis XVI. Violence and bloodshed ensue. Okay, it is a very violent and bloody war that goes through several phases. Excuse me. From 1789 until about 1792 or so, you have a moderate revolution, but then Louis XVI will be executed, and you end up with a very radical revolution from about 1792 to 1795. This is the period of the Reign of Terror, when executions of French people who were opposed to the revolution spike, and it is a very scary thing. This revolution, because it gets so out of control, will stoke fears of the revolution spreading. So some of the European powers are going to go to war with France to try to get it back on track. Now, Jefferson and the anti-federalists, they side with the French. I told you they were pro-French in their foreign policy. And what they, of course, argue is that the United States should be helping the French. They were our allies during the Revolution. They need our help now. And so we should be helping them in their revolution. Okay, Hamilton, of course, who is stability, order, pro-Britain, okay, and really a lot more conservative, has no desire to get involved in this, okay? And the Federalists and Hamilton, they were afraid of getting involved. And so Washington will declare neutrality, okay? Washington will issue a neutrality proclamation. He does not want to take sides in regards to the French Revolution, and has no desire to get involved, okay? So Washington wants no part of this conflict and issues the proclamation of neutrality. So we are going to be neutral. We are not going to help, okay? Now, this leads to a couple of strange things that happen. Okay, your textbook talks about the Genet affair, Citizen Genet. So President Washington did argue or did recognize the existence of the new French government, which is something that Jefferson had urged he should do. And so a French diplomat, okay, an ambassador, is sent to the United States. Okay, Edmund Charles or Edouard Genet, who quickly becomes known as Citizen Genet. He will land in Charleston. He's supposed to go and report himself to Washington as an ambassador from the French nation. He won't. Okay. So he goes out there and tries to start. He actually starts to try. He tries to start a rebellion in the South to take Florida away from Spain. Okay, and he also starts to pirate some English and Spanish vessels. He makes his way towards Philadelphia. Okay, and he basically starts trying to drag us into war on the side of the French. So he even said that he was going to appeal directly to the American people for them to get involved in the French Revolution. So Genet gets sent home because he insults Washington basically by not presenting him his papers. It also makes Jefferson look a little bad. And so while we declare neutrality with the French, we also have to deal with the British. The British have not evacuated the forts that they promised they would evacuate in 1793. The British were inciting Indian rebellions against us out on the frontier using those forts, which they promised they wouldn't do. The British also managed to start to interfere with our trade with the French. They don't want us trading with the French because they're at war with the French. So they start taking control of our merchant ships. And that's going to become a big issue. Not only do they start seizing some of our crews, but they will also start to kidnap some of our sailors. Okay, that is a policy called impressment. Okay, the British will start to impress our sailors, and that means that they will essentially kidnap them, claiming that they were actually deserters from the British Navy. And so they will force them onto the British ship and force them to work on the British ship until they get tired of them and they'll dump them off in some port somewhere if they survive. To try to deal with these problems, President Washington is going to send John Jay, Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. John Jay will be sent to England to try to negotiate a new treaty with the British. Jay has no bargaining power. He has nothing to bargain with. The British aren't really in a bargaining mood. But this is he's going to try to get the best that he can get from the British. So what they come away with becomes Jay's treaty. In 1794, Jay is going to try to negotiate the best treaty that he possibly can. So the British agree to pay for some of the damage they've caused to American ships, to abandon the American forts on the frontier. The Americans promised to pay their pre-Revolutionary War debts to British merchants, which they had never done. But other than that, there's not going to be a whole lot of substance to Jay's treaty. The British promised they won't impress any more American sailors, which they continue to do. Okay, it is, if you want to rate it, all right, on a scale of 1 to 10, most Americans at that time would call it about really probably about a -47. All right, it's terrible, but it is a treaty. And Washington is going to flex his muscles as the executive and get the Senate to ratify it. And to ratify it really pretty quietly and pretty secretly. Okay. The reason? Because we need a treaty. Okay. The secrecy actually is going to have a benefit, as you'll find out a little bit later on. Now, Jefferson hates this, and I'm going to tell you why. One, Jefferson feels like this is us pulling back close to England, which he did not want to do. After all, we'd fought a war with England to secure our independence. Why would we now draw back closer to them? Jefferson, too, is pro-French. And we had promised the French that we would not sign treaties without the French knowing about it, which we have just violated. Okay? So this, once again, sort of makes Jefferson really unhappy. Okay? It does have a side effect, though. The secrecy around Jay's Treaty ends up influencing the Spanish to seek us out to create a treaty with us. Okay. All right. The Spanish had gained control of New Orleans. This was part of the treaty from that ended the Revolutionary War. So the Spanish controlled everything west of the Mississippi. And what they had done to us, since we really can't prevent it, is they had closed off the Mississippi to us. They had closed off the Mississippi and New Orleans as a port. Okay, so we had some major border disputes with the Spanish, especially in Georgia and West Florida and those areas to the south. And so in retaliation, really, the Spanish have closed off New Orleans to us, and they are not real fond of us really getting it back. But then they get worried. When word comes out that we've made a treaty with England and they don't know the provisions, the Spanish get worried that this treaty is actually going to lead to a war. That what the Americans and the British are going to do is team up and push the Spanish out. And so, rather than chance that, the Spanish government decides to seek out a treaty with us. Okay? We will send an ambassador, Thomas Pinckney, the former governor of South Carolina, out to out to deal with the Spanish. And Pinckney, compared to John Jay earlier, has all of the bargaining power because the Spanish don't know what's going on. And so Pinckney's going to use that to his advantage. Okay. And essentially what he is going to do is to push the Spanish to move the border of Florida from mid-Georgia to the 31st parallel, which is pretty close to the current border now. So the border of West Florida is moved from basically from mid-Georgia, mid-Alabama, mid-Mississippi, down further south to the 31st parallel. So we get more territory and we settle some of that Spanish border controversy. Two, we get New Orleans opened back up to us, to American trade, and we get free navigation of the Mississippi. So we get to share the Mississippi River with the Spanish without having to pay duties to the Spanish. Okay. So we settle a border. We actually move the border of Florida down further south to the 31st parallel. That's a win. We get New Orleans reopened for us to use as a trading port. That's a win. And we get free navigation of the Mississippi. That's a win. Okay, so Pinckney's treaty is sometimes it's called the Treaty of San Lorenzo. The official name of it actually is the Treaty of San Lorenzo, but we call it here in America oftentimes Pinckney's Treaty. This is a big, big, big win for Washington. Okay, so neutrality with France, a weak, weak, weak treaty with the British, and a win in diplomacy with the Spanish. Okay, so this is a win on all fronts for Washington's foreign policy. Washington had been re-elected in 1792. We felt like we just could not go on without Washington as our leader. And so Washington has overseen a lot of these diplomatic successes, okay, and has kind of moved on into his next term. Washington is also the executive. And I told you guys that the executive needs to be a leader. And one of the best examples, and I probably hinted at this earlier, is the Whiskey Rebellion. Congress had passed a tax on American-made whiskey back in 1791 as part of Hamilton's fiscal plan to help pay off the national debt. All right, you got to understand something about whiskey. American farmers made whiskey because one of the things you can do with your excess grain at the end of the season, if you have enough stored for your livestock and you have enough stored for your seed corn for the next year, then you can take that grain, corn, whatever it is, and you can ferment it and make whiskey out of it. And the farmers used whiskey as a bartering tool. Okay, whiskey had lots of things and lots of uses. Okay, everything from an antiseptic to, of course, what you do with whiskey, and that's drink it. So it's a way of using that excess grain, but it's also a way of doing some backwoods trading. Now, in Pennsylvania, some of the farmers who really couldn't pay the tax are going to rebel, and they start to do some of the same things we had done to the British during the Stamp Act Rebellion, for example. They would attack the tax collectors. They would shoot at the federal officers. They refused to pay the tax. Okay. All right, that's an issue. Okay. And the federal government has to respond. And so here's a great example of Washington's leadership, and it's a great example of the powers that Washington has as executive that we did not have during the Articles of Confederation. If you guys remember, I told you guys about Shays' Rebellion, which happened in Massachusetts. There was no real way to put that down. But the Whiskey Rebellion leads to swift action from Washington, who takes control personally of the army. 13,000 troops are sent into Pennsylvania. And essentially, Washington says you're going to pay the tax or you're going to get shot. Okay? And most of the rebels give up, and they agree to start paying the taxes. It's a great show of authority and of force. Washington would see the laws of the nation executed, and it sets a precedent for the American citizens that says, look, you just can't ignore laws that you don't like. If you want to change a law that you don't like, you have to do it peacefully through constitutional means. Okay? You either get Congress to change the law, you pass an amendment, you change the people that are involved in it, but whatever you do, rebellion is not going to be tolerated. So Washington's response to the Whiskey Rebellion shows you just how powerful a leader he was. One of the other major things that happens is we will have some Indian problems. Okay, so Washington, as we start to push out into the Northwest Territory and push into places like Ohio and Indiana, we run into problems with the Native Americans. All right, for example, a Native American chief named Little Turtle will go to war against some of these new settlers, and this is exactly what the British were afraid of. This is why they tried to keep us bottled up behind the proclamation line of 1763. Because if we pushed west, we were going to get into areas that were still controlled by the Native Americans, and it would cause a war. Well, that's exactly what happened. Okay, despite treaties that had been signed, the Native Americans in this area still felt like this land was there, and so they want to fight. And of course, the British are there to supply arms for them. Washington will send one of his generals, Mad Anthony Wayne, into Ohio and Indiana to deal with the problem. Okay, so in August of 1794, near Toledo, okay, Matt Anthony Wayne and his men will push the Indians back to Fort Miami. The Indians are routed. Their fields are burned. Okay, this is known as the Battle of Fallen Timbers. And after the Native Americans are defeated, they will sign the Treaty of Grenville in 1795, where the Americans are given most of Ohio, Chicago, Detroit, and the Indians are forced off the land and given $20,000 worth of goods in exchange for acknowledging those existing claims. If we start to push out here into some of these areas in the old Northwest, you're going to need the government to be able to deal with the Native Americans. Okay, so Washington here proves that if we are pushing westward and we come under attack by the Native Americans, the federal government will respond. After 8 years, Washington will choose to step down after 2 terms of office. And his farewell address is always considered to be one of his most important, right, contributions to America. He was very frustrated by the development of political parties. He was frustrated by the disagreements between Hamilton and Jefferson, and he wanted to go home after fighting the Revolutionary War. And then after 8 years of being president, he wanted to go home. And so he refuses to stay in office any longer, and writes his farewell address. Okay, he delivers it, and he stresses that several major things. Okay, one, political parties are bad. Okay, he warned the nation against political parties. He also warns the nation about dangers of foreign entanglements, argues that we should not have permanent friends or foes, but instead we should no permanent friends or foes. Okay, he none of these permanent foreign entanglements. Okay, he stressed that morality in government was needed. So these things. I mean, you look back on Washington's farewell address, and his warnings about foreign entanglements have been heeded for a long time. But his warnings about political party divisions don't necessarily find the target that they need to. And so, after 8 years really of being president, Washington steps aside. And the election of 1796 is going to happen, and it's really the first contested election in American history. Because anytime, if Washington would have run again, he would have been elected again. So this throws the door open for our next president, John Adams. Okay. All right, we'll stop there, and I'll see you guys next week.